I'm going to get started. I'm conscious that people are still coming in, but I know we've got a packed panel tonight, and so I want to get started right away. My name's Georgina Hayden. I'm Director of the Centre for Global Research. I'm also the co-convener of the Gendered Violence and Abuse Research Alliance. And this event is brought to you by members of both of those groups. And I must say that one of the enormous pleasures of heading up the Centre for Global Research is that I get to introduce events like this. And I get to see the faces of people who have chosen to spend an hour and a half on a rainy, revolting Thursday afternoon extending their intellectual understanding of a very difficult problem. So thank you and congratulations for making a smart choice. I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people whose land this building occupies. I'd like you to think for a moment about the fact that Melbourne itself is built on a meeting place. And so it's very apt, I think, that we're coming together tonight and trying to think through a difficult problem together. I'm going to hand over now to Nicola Henry, who's going to introduce tonight's event and the panel to you. Sit back, enjoy, and have your questions ready. Thank you.
Hi everybody, thank you for coming tonight. My name is Nicola Henry. I'm a Vice-Chancellor's Principal Research Fellow in the Centre for Global Research at RMIT University. I'll be facilitating today's panel titled Counting the Violence, the Implications for Quantification for Policy and Practice on Gendered Violence. The panel has been organised by the Centre for Global Research and RMIT's Gendered Violence and Abuse Research Alliance, also called JVARA. I'd also like to begin first by acknowledging that our meeting today is being held on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people, and I wish to acknowledge them as traditional owners. I'd also like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and the elders from other communities who may be here today. I'd also like to take a minute's silence to acknowledge the life and loss of Fiona Richardson, Labor MP, Victoria's First Minister for Women, and an incredible advocate for gender equality who sadly passed away last night. Okay, so I'll introduce the panel very shortly, but just by way of a quick introduction for today's panel, today we'll be focusing on the power and the pitfalls of statistics and numbers in relation to gendered violence. Increasingly, scholars, practitioners, activists and government bodies are turning to indicators, algorithms and other statistical tools in order to construct knowledge about gendered violence, whether that be domestic or family violence, sexual assault, rape, wartime sexual violence, child marriage, trafficking, poverty, and female genital cutting. So quantification can help us to create public awareness. It can help to prompt political, legal and social action. It can also help to validate victim experiences of violence, and it also can help to ensure accountability at the individual, organisation and state level. But there are some downsides to quantification and how we interpret numbers. So today's panel, we will be discussing the power and the pitfalls of numbers. And we've seen the strengths and limitations quite clearly in the last few weeks in relation to the release of the Australian Human Rights Commission survey results on sexual violence and sexual assault at university campuses. The survey itself and the interpretation of those figures has been both highly contested, yet also extremely important, and I hope we can spend some time today also discussing that issue in relation to a whole bunch of other issues around gendered violence. So now I'll introduce you to our amazing panel. First up, we have Dr. Anastasia Powell. Anastasia is a Senior Research Fellow in Justice and Legal Studies at RMIT University. She specialises in sexual and intimate partner violence, as well as emerging forms of technology-facilitated sexual violence. Anastasia has published widely in these fields, including 5 books, and has contributed to policy-specific research on violence against women for the Victorian State and Australian Commonwealth governments. Most recently, Anastasia has contributed to research for the National Community Attitudes Towards Violence Against Women project, funded by the Australian Government and administered by Australia's National Research Office for Women's Safety. Next to Anna, we have Dr. Larissa Sandy. Larissa is a lecturer in the School of Global, Urban and Social Studies at RMIT University. She recently held a Vice-Chancellor's postdoctoral fellowship in criminology at Flinders University, with her projects being the first of its kind internationally to examine the effects of human trafficking laws and interventions for male and female sex workers in Cambodia. Larissa was also Research Fellow in the International HIV Program at the Australian Research Centre in Sex, Health and Society at La Trobe University and Research Analyst at the Australian Institute of Criminology. She has published widely on sex work and human trafficking, including numerous articles and other publications, and is the author of Women and Sex Work in Cambodia, Blood, Sweat and Tears. Next we have Dr. Mayart Costello. Mayart is Research Program Director at ANROSE, which is Australia's national research organisation for women's safety. Mayart commenced her career as a frontline social worker in sexual assault services, domestic violence services and women's health services in New South Wales and South Australia. Mayart has subsequently worked in a variety of strategic, policy, research, political and management roles in state and federal governments, non-government organisations, universities and children, youth and women's health services. Mayart maintained her clinical skills throughout this time by continuing to work on the after-hours crisis roster of the Eastern and Central Sydney Sexual Assault Service. Her most recent position prior to joining ANROSE was Manager of Violence Prevention and Response at New South Wales Kids, Families and New South Wales Health. And finally, we have Jo Crawford. Jo is the Research and Policy Lead for the Individual Deprivation Measure program at the International Women's Development Agency. Jo has more than 30 years' experience across government, civil society, universities and as a consultant, including policy roles within the Australian Government's Office for the Status of Women and the then Australian Agency for International Development. Jo was closely involved in an Australian Research Council linkage project to develop the Individual Deprivation Measure, also known as IDM, and I believe Jo will be speaking about that today, which is a new individual-level, gender-sensitive approach to poverty measurement that includes violence as one of 15 dimensions of life assessed to determine deprivation. By measuring at the individual level, the IDM can reveal how poverty varies with factors such as gender, age, disability and more, and the impact of intersections. Jo is now part of the Australian government-funded partnership between the Australian National University and IWDA to ready the IDM for global use by 2020. So basically for the panel today, the structure is as follows. So I'm going to give each panel member 2 minutes to start with. I know it's not very long, but just to give us a summary of their own experience working in the gendered violence field. And then there'll be a set of questions from me to the panel. And then we'll have 30 minutes of questions from you, the audience. So please feel free to start jotting down questions as we go. And just one further thing before I stop talking. The Twitter hashtag, if you want to tweet anything today, the Twitter hashtag to use is hashtag global frictions, one word. Okay, so we'll start with Anna, if you want to just 2-minute summary of the work that you're doing in this space.
Thank you, Nicola. And Larissa and I just exchanged nervous glances because both of us didn't realise and read the instruction that we were meant to start with a little brief about our own research. We've prepared some other notes for some of the discussion, so mine will be very brief. So I suppose my research, since my doctoral research, which was on young people's negotiation of consent, has really focused on applied approaches to responding and preventing violence against women. So I've focused on sexual violence and harassment as well as domestic and family violence within that. And I suppose I've been very inspired by mentors and colleagues within criminology who have focused the attention on the research has to make a difference. The research has to be about doing some good in the community and making some sort of change that improves women's lives. And that's the approach that I've taken throughout my research career to date, and it's part of the reason that a lot of my research is collaborative with government agencies, with non-government organisations, with representatives from the domestic and sexual violence sectors, and I probably have as much research published in grey reports and commissioned reports as I do in other sort of more scholarly sources, precisely because I'm driven by wanting to make a difference. And so in speaking about this issue of quantification, one of the things that I've observed in more recent years of my career is that much of my previous research had been qualitative. It had been about the experiences, mostly of women in relation to violence. And certainly that work is incredibly important, and I, remain really focused on making sure that we give voice to the experiences of women. But at the end of the day, what seems to get policy traction and what seems to get results is a survey with statistics that you can give to government or that you can give to policy advocates and say, here's the figure, this is a problem, we need to do something about it. And certainly within the last few years, my research, and including collaborative research with Nicola, has used, I think to great effect, quantitative research to draw attention to emerging issues of violence, but also, remaining cognizant that that carries tensions and dilemmas within it. And so that's something I think we'll be further unpacking on the panel today.
And maybe that will be my role. So for my experience, especially around statistics, my background is anthropology. So with my PhD, I did ethnography of sex work in Cambodia, and that was really focusing on documenting oral histories of women that were working in brothel shanties in Cambodia. And I'm still very much work within that field of anthropology and ethnography, and a bit of a left turn coming into criminology now. So that really speaks about my research and my experience. But also because of my work and working in sex work, of course, I do come head to head with debates around trafficking and particularly sex trafficking. So for me today, what I'm hoping to do, especially in this panel, is to really start critically unpacking what Sally Engelmary has really outlined in her book, The Seductions of Quantification. So I'm hoping that I can talk a little bit more about some of those tensions and issues, especially around the uses of statistics and some of the possible abuses of those as well, speaking from the experience that I have from working within trafficking, but also with that critical trafficking studies perspective.
Thank you. So I think I also didn't read the instructions very well because I prepared just a few notes on what I saw, some of the key challenges and opportunities, but I'm going to ad-lib it a little bit to say I guess I'm coming at this issue predominantly, although I'm definitely doing, and particularly now as the Director of the Research Program at ANROS, have responsibility for a range of research projects, both in terms of oversighting the projects and developing up and funding new research. My background, so I guess my academic background, my PhD was actually on federal government policy responses to violence against women under the Howard government, and particularly the intersection and the interface with hegemonic masculinity. And in a way, quantification is fairly far removed from that. But what I have got is a really strong history in both politics and policy, and service delivery, where I'm effectively an end user of that research and know the power and value of quantification and also the limits of quantification in getting traction, getting policy traction. And in terms of just going back to my prepared notes, one of the things I'd like to say, just to add on to what Anna was saying, just around, I guess, key directions and the traction that quantification gets, I agree with that to a point, but I also think what's often missing is we're really good at describing the problem. As policymakers and for policymakers, we often need the next step, and having been somebody who's commissioned and funded services, we often have very little by way of quantification and by way of research that tells us what works, what doesn't work, where we should invest funding, where we shouldn't. So knowing about the problem is important. It's important giving voice to people's experiences, but at the same time we also need to know what works and what doesn't work, and if we really want research to get traction, I think that's really important. Also in misreading, I talked about just noted some of what I saw to be the challenges that currently are facing the field. And I'd say, first of all, is just the challenge around hard-to-reach populations, and quantification is really problematic around particularly diversity populations and how we actually adequately access and provide voice to those populations. But also, I'd say there's broader challenge at the moment with the really sustained and heightened public attention to gendered violence, to domestic and family violence in particular, and you have just a whole range of people coming out of the woodwork who are suddenly experts on violence against women, or want to tell you their latest bit of research that's violence against women. And so often coming from a position where it's had less focus to a position where it's had sustained attention has got both benefits and disadvantages. In benefits of getting new ideas and really embracing what the sort of new voices in this space can give us, but also disadvantages in perhaps falling into some of the pitfalls of not understanding the concepts of violence against women, of gendered violence, and perhaps making some of the common mistakes that we thought we'd dealt with in the field, but we're now going back and revisiting and arguing on. And then the final thing I'd just say is our quantification tends to focus on victims, and that's a really challenging thing for me, because if we look at how we define the problem of violence against women, I'm really interested in this concept of policy problems and how they're defined and what solution comes out of that definition. We tend to focus, most of our quantification is about victims' experiences, how many people have experienced what types of violence, that sort of stuff. If we really want to make a difference in the incidence of violence against women, we need to, one, look at obviously prevention and much further downstream issues. But if we're going to respond to perpetration, we need to look at quantification of perpetration. We don't have things like, we have the personal safety survey, we don't have the kind of perpetration surveys that they do in, for example, Rachel Dukes does in South Africa. So needing to actually move beyond to, if the side of the problem is men and men's violence, then we need to start quantifying that violence, not quantifying victims' experience.
I'm just going to go because I can't actually hear what everyone's saying.
And if you're playing a timekeeping role, if we're looking out there, we can't see you and see waving for us either. So. Can I go on? So I just want to take a little bit of time to talk briefly about the work that we're doing on the individual deprivation measure, because it's a little bit different from what others are doing. We're not measuring violence per se. We're trying to find a way to give visibility to violence as a contribution to multidimensional gender-sensitive deprivation. It's a different enterprise in some ways, but one that brings into sharp relief, I think, some of the definitional challenges and the risks and the priorities that others are talking about. So I'm just going to very quickly put some slides up to kind of say why measure violence in relation to deprivation, and where did the individual deprivation measure come from? At the moment, poverty is measured at the household level, which is assuming that everybody in the household is in the same situation. It makes it impossible to see if there are differences in deprivation across members of the household, or indeed if multiple deprivations are concentrated in one person versus distributed across the household members. So if you're going to understand the way in which deprivation intersects with age, with sex, with sexual orientation and gender identity, with caste, race, you need to measure at the individual level, yeah? So what we did was, with part of an Australian Research Council team, international research collaboration, started rather than with expert views on how poverty should be measured, we went across 6 countries, multiple sites in each country, to interview men and women about how they thought poverty should be defined, and then how they thought that it should be measured. And then we went back and we said we heard 25 possible things. That's too many for a multidimensional measure. What are the priorities under that? And did that with the same in the same 6 countries, 18 sites across each, and then developed a measure and trialled it in the Philippines. And what poor people, why include violence in a measure of deprivation, is because poor people said it had a huge impact on their lives. We know also that obviously it has in terms of women in particular, but not only women, men also, it impacts on people's ability to earn, it impacts on their expenditure and their costs. And so we essentially, when we were building the measure, which is up here, 15 dimensions covering both economic and social aspects of life, these are the things that poor women and men across multiple countries said, if we are going to move out of poverty, having $1.90 in our pockets doesn't cut it. If we're in the Solomons where we're seeing land being denuded, trees cut down, our environment, we can't grow our food, we can't move out of poverty. And equally, people spoke about the fear of violence. Many women would speak about the violence in their own homes, but also the risks of violence associated with going and collecting fuel wood, water, that kind of thing. But trying to actually, the other thing we're trying to do with the IDM is to get an insight into deprivation inside the household. You need to ask more than one person in the household about their experiences so that you can start to get a sense of the way in which access to resources and opportunities differ across the household. And that obviously brings profound challenges in terms of violence. Just very quickly, because I'll come back to it as later on, how it works. Essentially, it's an aggregate composite measure. We interview currently only adults. There's work underway to develop a companion measure for children. 15 dimensions. The data for that is collected by concrete questions with a number of indicators in each dimension. You don't have to add it all up into some overall number, and some people think that the greatest power in these kinds of measures is the ability to kind of look at across. Because we ask all of these questions of one person as opposed to picking results from different data sets, it makes it possible to see the ways in which there are interrelationships between these factors. So between violence and voice, time use, access to water and sanitation, for example. So that's
great. Well, thank you. And I can finally hear, which is good because I'm sorry I didn't hear what the three panellists said to begin with. All right, so I want to start by asking the panel to reflect on their understandings of gendered violence. So there have been a number of criticisms levelled at gendered violence researchers and practitioners and others. So three that I've come up with that I'd like the panel to reflect on is the first is that gendered violence or gender-based violence, some argue is exclusionary, that it predominantly focuses on female victims and male perpetrators. The second critique is that some have said that we should be calling the problem men's violence against women and not pretending that it's a gender-neutral issue, so really kind of an opposing thought to the first criticism. And the third is that there isn't consensus on what actually constitutes gendered violence in the first place. So some, for instance, would argue that female genital cutting or female genital mutilation, as some people call it, child marriage, trafficking and sex work are indeed forms of gendered violence, whereas other people would argue that they're not. So I'm just wondering if the panel could reflect on their understandings of gendered violence and to reflect on those three criticisms. And maybe if we can start with Jo.
Thanks, Nicola. So, as I was saying earlier, one of the challenges for us is that we are trying to conceptualise violence as a dimension of gender-sensitive multidimensional poverty as opposed to trying to measure violence in and of itself. So, that raises all kinds of questions for us about, does this require asking about gendered violence? Does it require asking about gender-based violence? Do we ask the same questions of women and men when we know that the pattern of violence and the places in which that violence is experienced is different from women and men? But if we say asking equivalent questions would be asking different questions about the nature of violence, then that raises all kinds of questions when you're developing a composite measure. And so our commitment from the original participatory work we did was very much trying to honour the views of both poor men and women that violence was significant in their lives. If you're in the highlands of Papua New Guinea and you're a woman, that's terrible. But young men are also experiencing really high rates of violence that is absolutely impacting their livelihoods. So the challenge for us was, how do we try to conceptualise this in a way that recognises that we're not asking a whole survey about the nature of violence, we're trying to ask some key questions in a multi-topic survey, so there are all kinds of time constraints around and ask it of both men and women. So where we started was the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative's work on missing dimensions of poverty, and they've done some work towards a universal measure of violence. They said they thought that, it had questions about perpetration, so mostly the questions were quite specific and technical questions about describing types of violence, but they also recommended getting information about perpetrators, which is really problematic if you're going to be asking questions of more than one person in the household. So we started off with these questions, which are really quite specific about types of violence experienced, then trying to get a sense of frequency of violence and also apprehension of future violence. So have you experienced things in the last 12 months, but do you anticipate experiencing it in the next 12 months? In leading up to the questions, we spoke to people about reaffirming the privacy of the conversations, the security of the data, that no one would know how they answered, that there's no questions that we're asking that would identify either a perpetrator or the location of the violence. But in use, we think that in practice that's not going to be sufficient for people who are in a household with a perpetrator. So that raises then all kinds of questions which researchers on violence would be really familiar with around the quality of the data, non-response rates, refusing to answer and so on. So, and most importantly, potential risk and safety. So a lot of our work has really been on trying to look at method sampling and so on, which I won't go into now, but we did try to change some of the questions a bit more following peer review, but again focusing very much in the same sort of area. So trying to get a picture of intensity of violence and also frequency of incident.
Okay. Yeah, I'd open up to the rest of the panel to comment on the question that I posed. Yeah, no worries.
So look, it's a really good question to ask, and of course I'm sort of one of those people that would disagree with that blanket categorisation of sex work as gendered violence or more as violence against women. And I think as the panel goes on, you'll probably, hopefully, help understand my position. And when I'm talking about gendered violence, what I'm talking about is violence that's embedded in relationships, and that those relationships are often quite unequal relationships as well. But it's also embedded in masculinities and femininities, overlaid with race, class, religion. So we're really talking about violence that's embedded in gender inequality and patriarchal structures. So, for me, when I'm talking about gendered violence, I'm not defining it in very narrow sort of interpersonal terms and relationships, or just seeing it exclusively as, say, rape or intimate partner violence. For me, gendered violence is something that's a little bit broader than that. So, it's about patriarchal social structures and gender difference. And there within gender difference and patriarchal social structures as well, we've got very varied cultural meanings and cultural differences and understandings that are also attached to that as well. And it's also about the social and economic inequalities that are underlying those different forms of violence. And so when we're talking about types and some examples, of course you would include rape and intimate partner violence, but I'd also include acts that are committed and perpetrated by the state, especially state violence by the police and military. I'm thinking about things like sexual abuse and sexual assault in conflict, forced marriage, forced sterilisations, forced abortions, and I'd also include sex worker extortion and assault in that list as well. And another thing I'd think about would be violence against the LGBTIQ community, where we see the intersection of homophobia, transphobia, biphobia and gender. So for me, I'm sometimes a little bit cautious about this move that's often made between gendered violence as being code for women and the accompanying, heteronormative frameworks and responses that we'll see with that as well, because often a lot of that is rendered silent in our attempts to try and count violence and to theorise about it.
I suspect that some of what I've got to say is quite similar to Larissa. I mean, I do tend to use violence against women as a shorthand for men's violence against women, of which we know the majority is intimate partner and sexual violence. And similar to, I think our panellists, I don't see gendered violence as a substitute for the terms violence against women or men's violence against women. I think sometimes that is how it's used, but, I refer to it as a broader sort of catch-all term for forms of interpersonal violence that are fundamentally to do with gender roles and gender positionings and gender inequality and other intersecting forms of inequality. And I think that there is a move to use that term gendered violence to be more inclusive of violence that is on the basis of transgender or gender identity or gender expression, for instance, and including sexuality-based violence as well, which is ultimately often based on heterosexism and is itself based on a set of assumptions around gender roles and gender behaviours. And in fact, that's why the Gendered Violence and Abuse Research Alliance at RMIT, or JVARA, chose to group under the banner of gendered violence rather than a narrower concept of men's violence against women. It was something that the group had an awful lot of discussion about, because initially what brought us together was a smaller set of researchers who were doing work on domestic violence. And so we had that conversation about broadening out how we would band together our group of researchers. And we wanted to recognise that some of the research that's done at RMIT does involve engaging with issues of violence experienced particularly by gender and sexuality diverse people. But I think it's also important to acknowledge, and my doctoral student, Shays Mortimer, who's in the audience here tonight, is doing research on the experiences of LGBTIQ people in terms of sexual violence. And one of the problems that certainly her work recognises, and I think we're beginning to see more conversations about, is that sometimes we use the term gender in a way that we intend to be more inclusive, but in practice much of that research is still about men's violence against women. And so the inclusiveness kind of becomes a sort of a lip service to intersectionality rather than necessarily being about, sort of expanding our definitions and our understandings of violence and trying to be more inclusive in the way that we're researching it.
So I'm going to broadly agree, but also take a slightly different tact as well. For me, first of all, I guess I'd say, particularly coming from a perspective of policy, you often don't have the luxury of theorising too much. And if you've ever tried to write a succinct policy document, trying to get even terminology like domestic and family violence, sexual assault, sexual violence and all forms of other violence against women, etc., 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 to be inclusive, you start becoming unintelligible. So I think sometimes you have to compromise in a policy context, and sometimes you compromise by using terms like gendered violence as a kind of loose coverall. But having said that, I just wanted to make a couple of points, I guess, around terminology. First of all, for me, gendered violence is, I think I agree with, it's really what both the previous two speakers have said around issues around gender inequality and the nature of violence in that context. But for me also, and issues of patriarchy, etc. For me, I loosely describe gender violence, or use in my head gender violence, to be inclusive of any kind of intimate related violence, like bodily or relationship related, and particularly relationship types of violence that women more commonly and disproportionately experience than men, particularly around things like sexual assault, domestic and family violence, but also is inclusive of the range of other forms of violence like cutting, genital cutting. So that's the first thing for me. But the second thing for me is I think it's really important for me that gendered violence doesn't just exist at the level of individual embodiment. And I think one of the key examples I use is I quite comfortably include men's experiences of being perpetrated, of experience, for example, sexual assault by other men in the form of gendered violence. And one of the reasons I comfortably include that is from my knowledge of working as a sexual assault counsellor with men who talk about one of the most confronting things they experience of having been raped is being made to feel like a woman. And that's a really interesting dynamic for me about showing the power of the nature of gender and the nature of the complexity of gender going beyond individual embodiment. So you have forms of violence that experience, you're both your actor and your perpetrator and your victim in that case are both men, and yet still gender inequality comes through that experience and the notion of patriarchy and the notion of the impact of patriarchy. However, having said all that, I'm also going to say I don't like the term gendered violence. And one of the reasons I don't like the term gendered violence is because if you think about it, if you think about one of those, I suppose, more stereotypical and what we know to be statistically more likely to be the experiences of men experiencing violence, it's often experiences of violence that are in public places. Men often experience even higher rates of violence than women, but that violence is qualitatively different. It's in a public place, more likely to be from a stranger, more likely to be in a place of entertainment or recreation as opposed to the home. But yet we don't call that gendered violence. And for me, it reinforces that, and I'm going to probably go a little bit esoteric and feminist here, but it reinforces that concept that men are normal, and so their experiences of violence are quote-unquote violence, but women's experiences of violence, those forms of violence we group under as women's experience, are the gendered violence. Yet I would argue that men beating each other up in the pub would have a lot of masculinity going on there. There'd be a lot about gender going on there, but we don't name it like that. Yet when we talk about women's common experiences, we name it as gendered. So for me, it also is a bit of a complicated term in that as somebody coming from policy, I embraced it of going, I need something shorthand, but as from a theoretical perspective, I think it's got immense challenges to it as well.
Okay, well, I'll move on to the next question. So putting aside differences in opinions in regards to terminology, why are numbers so powerful? Why are they so seductive in generating knowledge on gendered violence? And can't we just use storytelling? Can't we just use the personal narratives of victim survivors to attract attention to the issue? Maybe we can start with Mayart.
Okay, the first thing I would say, I've worked in a minister's office, I've worked in policy. The reality is that numbers do talk. To get traction on an issue, to get funding to an issue, you do need to demonstrate the scope of the problem, and you need to demonstrate that it's a big problem for people to actually make a difference, for it to make a difference, and to, I guess, to bring it to the attention of people who control resources and can allocate those resources as they're needed, and also to prevent minimisation. So often what feminists, particularly in some of the kind of 1970s feminism and consciousness raising stuff, was actually about trying to just demonstrate the extent of the problem by getting people to talk out. And also to appropriately respond to the quantum of the problem, to not be able to just say this is just one or two people, but to actually really get a sense of the stats. However, having said that, my experience is also that numbers alone do not work. And we are, and I'd say human beings are storytellers, we are social creatures, we need to relate to things, and most people don't relate to numbers. So for me, personal narratives are as important as the numbers, but we need to make them work in partnership with the numbers so that those personal narratives aren't just dismissed as a one-off experience. And just one example of this for me is the work ANROS has done, and they often do this they've recently done this in the census data as well, to kind of make people relate to the data, is providing the numbers. So this is the work ANROS did at the additional analysis of the PSS, which Dr. Peter Cox from my team did a report on, was the importance of, yes, quantifying it, saying what the numbers are, explaining what the issue is, but also providing, in that case it was the story of Jane, of providing a kind of identifiable example of saying, this is your common experience of violence, and walk through this story of what a lot of women are experiencing. They did it recently also in the census data of doing the same kind of thing, of providing storytelling as a method of getting people to engage with numbers. So I kind of say they're important to make a difference, but if you really want to get traction, you need to add it with some stories too.
And open up to the panel for further comments.
If I can. I just want to follow up, especially on storytelling and using that as a way to get engagement, and especially around numbers. This is quite a serious issue in trafficking and trafficking work. And the problem that I see and happening in a lot of trafficking research is these individual stories that are being used to give meaning and power to numbers. And because we're then also with trafficking, we're talking about something that's seen as being part of organised crime. And also we then see this willingness in the public as well as researchers to accept somewhat mythical claims about the size and extent of certain lurking dangers. So trafficking is an area where we see really huge attention-grabbing numbers. I think recent estimates say about 27 million people are held in what's termed modern-day slavery. And what we have happening with trafficking research is this constant zooming in and zooming out. We have a personal narrative that's put forward as the experience, that common example. And so then that story becomes a bit of a type. And there's a bit of a pro forma structure in a lot of trafficking research and trafficking reports, where that report will usually open with a woman's horrific and graphic testimony, and then the passage is closed with an appeal to the extraordinary number of victims of trafficking and people in slavery. And what happens here is we've got this combination of personal narrative and shocking numbers, and it actually functions to start suspending disbelief. So it creates this sense of panic and urgency, and the numbers quite literally shock you into action. And we see a very common refrain with trafficking is this urgent need to stop the traffic. But what also happens here is it works to shut down criticism as well. So no one really asks about how those numbers and how those statistics were derived and how the numbers were generated. So I do think we do need to use storytelling, of course, to raise awareness, but you also need to be really quite careful about some of the aspects of that, especially in trafficking, where stories become quite hyper-singularised, and we have this individual human face of modern-day slavery being linked with millions of other victims, and this then combined with a politics of pity, because we need to ask ourselves, and I think this is a really important question, what kind of change are we going to generate if we're working from that platform? And in that politics of pity as well, we also need to be really careful with the massification of this collection of unfortunates and appeals then being made to the fortunates. And these fortunates are often located in wealthy so-called first world nations, and appeals to them to end their suffering. So we need to think about some of the ethical complexities of bearing witness, and especially the fact that, just like other people, victim survivors of trafficking can also embellish the truth. And so some stories might not actually represent the truth of lived experiences, especially when we're seeing these testimonies being used for purposes other than bearing witness, and in areas especially like fundraising. Okay. And I just want to talk a little bit more. I have an example, of course. I want to talk a little bit more about this because this question is, I think, one of the biggest ones for trafficking as well. And I want to give an example of some of the flow-on effects of the quantification of knowledge in this area. And so a direct result of the quantification has been the US government's TIP reports. And they link with this global crisis in trafficking, and they link that to country rankings based on compliance to US mandated and defined minimum standards for combating trafficking. So these country responses are compiled by the US government, they're quantified and ranked, and nations are then placed on tiers. If you go down into the lower tiers, and especially to a Tier 3 country, you face the termination of non-humanitarian aid and non-trade related aid, and also US opposition to loans from the International Monetary Fund and World Bank. So here we have, a direct effect of this quantification in the area of trafficking is the US acting as this kind of self-appointed global sheriff. They're developing indicators and rankings. A lot of that's not done with academics and experts in the field as well. They're then penalising countries and blocking access to aid and development loans. And it's a really big thing when we're talking about aid-dependent countries and the situation that they're facing. And, I do see this, that flow-on effect here. It's, a really strong example of a form of structural violence.
So I want to sort of take us back to the local setting, if you like, because when I think about this question about the power of numbers and what have numbers, I suppose what kind of action has kind of flowed from this power of numbers, I can't help but reflect here in Victoria on the impact that this first burden of disease report from Vic Health had back in 2004. So this research that found that intimate partner violence was responsible for more ill health and premature death in Victorian women aged 15 to 45 than a whole series of other well-known health risk factors, including high blood pressure, obesity and smoking. So the framing of violence against women as a quantifiable public health problem that had countable costs to the local economy really has carried us through over a decade now of concerted research, government policy and programming on violence and on its prevention. And I do think that it's in large part the power of numbers and the costs of partner violence in terms of the burden of disease and the statistical modelling that report did that showed that more so than obesity, smoking, but also things like alcohol and illicit drugs, that partner violence had a greater cost to our local community, and responding to partner violence had a greater cost than some of those really well-known health factors, really created the impetus to try and prevent violence before it occurs. It really created a sort of a basis for advocacy and for work with government to say, if you're only responding to the problem, if you're not trying to address its underlying causes and stop this before it becomes a problem, then you're not doing all that you can do to actually save that investment of money in responding to the problem. And that might not sound like a very palatable basis for responding to violence against women, especially from those of us that are motivated by a concern with social justice and human rights, and there are lots of problems with that I'll be happy to talk to throughout the panel. But I think at the end of the day, that report and other reports like it, including the several reports now that have been done on the costs of violence against women to the Australian economy more broadly, these reports really have prompted us to have a shift in policy focus towards primary prevention, towards addressing the underlying gendered inequality and gendered drivers of violence, and it's come in part from quantifying the problem as a public health problem. So not to say that there aren't lots of issues, but I just thought I'd give a bit of a slightly more positive news story from the local Victorian context.
I'm a fan of data and quantification as a general principle, without wanting at all to disregard the politics, which we'll come back to. I think the politics are to be managed. They're not an argument for not having good data. And I sit very much, I think, in the same space as Mayart and Anna. I spent 10 years working in government. Governments of all shapes have budgets that are constrained, and you need to make allocation of those resources, and having data that points to scale and scope of a problem helps you know where to focus those resources, and then, done again, helps you know whether the things that you're doing are making any difference to that problem. So for me, it's a really fundamental public policy question that it's critical to have good data. The question is that we need to be the essential point is we need to be measuring what matters. And one of the dimensions of the sort of gender equality gap over the years has been the persistent under-measurement of the things that matter for gender equality. The poverty data work that I work on is just one example. If you're measuring it at the household level, as though everyone in that household is in the same situation, when we know that's not true, you can see improvements in an economy in an area which is leading to certain kinds of jobs in the formal sector and suggesting that there's all of this growth happening when in fact there's a whole lot of people who are not able to benefit from that or who are experiencing other kinds of aspects of deprivation and poverty that means that they're not able to move freely, they're not able to avail themselves of any of those opportunities. If we're not measuring those things, we simply can't see it. So, and for me too, the sort of the data and the political impetus is really critical. It's no mistake that what we see often is a claim for visibility and measurement, to make people's problems visible as part of trying to advocate for greater attention to it and greater resources for it. So I'm not trying to be Pollyanna-ish at all about the political challenges, but I think that they are arguments for better data literacy, but also, I'm completely with you about the importance of storytelling that goes alongside it, as well as an understanding of context. In the end, there are, which ducks get lined up in which particular budget context is a matter of sure, detailed information about the scale of the problem and the money that's available and why it needs to be addressed, but also people who are moved by something and understanding that the right moment is here to do something. The politics of this we need to be very cognizant of, but it's not a reason for not having really good data.
Okay, great. All right, so you probably all heard the saying that numbers don't lie, but also numbers don't tell the whole truth. I'm just wondering if I can ask the panel to reflect on any times in your own work or in the work of others where the numbers don't quite match up to the lived experiences of victim survivors, or they don't match up to the qualitative research that's been done in this area. So maybe if we could start with Anna.
Thanks. And I think it's also often said, of course, that there are three kinds of lies, damned lies and statistics. Someone had to say it. I guess myself, having done a lot of research, or increasing amount of quantitative research on violence against women in recent years, it is certainly the case that how you define the violence and the specific questions that you ask about that violence are going to result in different proportions of people disclosing those experiences. And I just want to give you two examples. One is the most, probably one of the most well-known examples of this, which is the Australian research done from the Australian Human Rights Commission on workplace sexual harassment. So in the 2012 survey, for instance, which is the most recent report, you can go and get it from their website, participants were first given the legal definition of sexual harassment, and they were asked if they'd ever experienced that harassment. And only 3% of respondents said that they'd experienced sexual harassment based on that legal definition. But the survey went on to ask, of all the people that said no, they hadn't experienced sexual harassment, the survey gave them a whole range of specific behaviours, including things like inappropriate staring and leering, sexually suggestive comments or jokes, sexually explicit emails or text messages, and requests or pressure for sex or other sexual acts. When asked that set of behavioural questions, a further 18% of respondents went on to say that they had in fact experienced something that meets the legal definition of sexual harassment. And that's how the Australian Human Rights Commission calculated its overall prevalence rate of 21% of Australians saying that they've experienced sexual harassment since the age of 15. Now, it's not a surprise, I suspect, to this audience that those rates are also highly gendered. So 25% of women, compared with 16% of men, report experiencing sexual harassment, and that's based on a combination of both the legal definition and the behavioural questions. And that's another issue that I think we sometimes see in quantification, is that the overall figures sometimes don't actually tell us very much about the nature of the problem. It's not until you start to break that down by key factors like gender, but also age, ability, sexuality and so on, that you start to really get a clearer picture of the nature of the problem. The second quick example that I just wanted to give you was from our own research, from Nicola and my research into technology-facilitated sexual violence and harassment. And we observed an interesting issue to do with the ways that men and women were answering in quite different ways in relation to one question on our recent survey research. So we had a question in there about whether respondents had ever experienced unwanted sexual advances or requests via email. And we found that men and women answered in similar proportions to that particular survey item. But when we went on to analyse the qualitative comments from our respondents, what I found was that a lot of men were actually describing having received a spam email that was advertising for sexual services or sexual products, while women, by contrast, were describing direct personal approaches from men. So in our case, the way that we asked the question was certainly a factor in terms of misrepresenting perhaps the gendered nature of that type of sexual harassment, but also it was a matter of the different positioning of men and women in the world, such that men even thought that that kind of a sexual harassment, that including spam emails and requests, was kind of what we were intending to kind of get at understanding. And what it meant was that statistic then was obscuring the true nature and character of that particular type of sexual harassment that men and women were experiencing. So I suppose what both of those examples point to is the importance of how we ask the questions about experiences of violence and how we make sense of that subjectively different nature or character that men's and women's different experiences might actually carry. We can certainly, and I think we should rightly, be very frustrated at spam emails as being a form of some kind of harassment and some kind of unwanted communication. But it's not the same nature of direct, personal and targeted sexual requests that women frequently do experience. So it's important for research to be mindful about what might be underlying the numbers. And it's also why I think you just can't do quantitative research in complete isolation from qualitative research in relation to gendered violence, because you often do need good qualitative material to really make sense of the character and the nature of the behaviours that are underlying the numbers.
So I'd like to use a couple of examples to talk about some of the limitations of quantification and particularly some of those times where things don't match up to what you expect. My first one would just to be, and my first two are related really around 1 in 3, so the men's rights organisation 1 in 3 that argues that 1 in 3 victims of domestic and family violence are men. So the first thing I'd argue, or that I want to talk about in relation to this, numbers not telling you the story that you expect to see, is just the history of the conflict tactics scale. And so for those of you who don't know this, it was a scale developed by Strauss and Gelles in the US, and it came out consistently with findings that men and women are equally violent in relationships. But it goes again to what Anna's saying, is once they started unpacking the questions that were being asked, they weren't asking questions that fit with women's experiences, and they were also had, I think, 2 major flaws. One, not including forms of violence that women commonly experience, although I will acknowledge that later forms of conflict tactics scale did do that. So, for example, sexual assault wasn't included in the first conflict tactics scale, which means that a woman could be raped by her partner. If she slaps him on the hand during that rape, she would get a rating of 1 for having perpetrated violence. He would get 0 because sexual assault wasn't included. So that's one example of that. The second is also not taking into account the impact of the violence. So again, a similar rating, woman and man both hit each other. The hit leads the woman to being hospitalised and causes substantial damage. The hit causes no damage to the man in terms of physical assault, physical damage, and yet it's equally considered one score against each other. So my first challenge is the quantification, depending on how you ask the questions, can come out with some really interesting numbers. But the second one is perhaps sharing a story that's in some ways embarrassing but also instructive. I gave evidence to the Senate inquiry on domestic violence in Australia, and the 1 in 3 campaign took issue with a number of bits of my evidence. And when I put in a subsequent supplementary submission, I spent a lot of time going back through the PSS, and I had a lot of times, and I'm an expert in this area, and I went, oh my God, they're right, it is 1 in 3, etc. But when you look really closely about what your definitions are, what your parameters are, they're not specific. So their statement only makes sense if you start saying something like this: 1 in 3 people who've experienced an incident of violence in the last 12 months, and it is only in the last 12 months. Once you start looking at lifetime prevalence, you're going up to about 1 in 5 or 6. So in the last 12 months is a man. Now, that incident of violence can be a single slap, or it could be sustained, prolonged, coercive control, physical assault. So you start to get some of the limitations of crime victimisation surveys and quantification, where you say the broader context of the violence isn't there. Some women will say, when we look at domestic violence qualitative research, that he never had to hit me. He used a range of other forms of intimidation and control, which again, if we go back to conflict tactics scale, she's living in terror, and yet wouldn't get, he wouldn't get even a strike of 1 against him. The other really key, I think, strategy that 1 in 3 use, which shows some of the limitations of quantification, is that they give percentages rather than sheer numbers. So to give you an example, 1 in 3 might say something like 90% of men who've experienced sexual violence don't report to the police. This compares to 40% of women who don't report to the police. This is a travesty. Men need more support to report to the police. Once you look at the actual numbers, we're talking about such smaller levels of reporting to begin with that 90% might be 9 men who haven't reported, compared to 9,000 women who haven't reported. And yet, because the rates of sexual assault are so much higher for women than they are for men, if you just use statistics and percentages rather than numbers, you're not getting a real understanding of the problem. So one of the things that we started to do at ANROS to try and explain PSS data and try and unravel some of those challenging use of quantification is to start using sheer numbers. So we might say 60% of people have experienced X, which equates to 50,000 people or 50,000 Australians. So I think that's really important. And then the final example I'd use is actually from a fantastic piece of research which Cathy Vaughan led for ANROS, which is called the Aspire Project. And what was really interesting here, and I think this demonstrates the value of qualitative research in bringing out some of the challenges of quant research, is that the PSS showed us that there are higher rates of reporting from cold women to the police. So from culturally and linguistically diverse women, there were much higher rates of reporting to the police than we anticipate and than we expect, particularly with a lot of the knowledge around the vulnerabilities and the increased challenges for women from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. It's the limitation, or that the quant data showed us really not what we expected to happen. But when we looked at the qual experience that came out of Cathy's research, there was some really interesting stuff there that helped explain those stats of things like most communities and countries around the world have a police service of some description, so they're an identifiable public service or public body in the way that other services like domestic and family violence services might not be for Australians. But also, when culturally and linguistically diverse women were reporting to the police, it was often when the violence was severe. It was often their first point of contact. It wasn't, they hadn't gone through a service or another form of support before they got to police. So the violence they were experiencing, again, the quant didn't tell us that qualitative experience of those women that were having, which Kathy's research helped show us.
We are going to open to the floor very quickly, but I'll just get a quick response from Larissa and Joe, just if you don't mind being really quick. Time's gone very quickly.
I just want to say two quick things, which is the challenge of trying to give and to reflect, to measure violence for both men and women, but in a way which recognises those different experiences, is significant. So when the data, in our first uses of the IDM outside of the research context in Fiji, was showing broadly equal rates of violence against men and women. And the Fiji Women's Crisis Centre that we were working with, so one way to help in the telling of these stories is to do work with the initial findings with stakeholders and go, how does this fit with your experience? What would you do with this? What are the issues here that you're seeing? And they were very concerned in particular about the results being used to suggest that to raise questions about the prevalence data that the Fiji Women's Crisis Centre and others had collected. So that was one of the reasons when we have been reviewing the survey, going back and looking very closely at how we can, not only from a safety point of view, but in terms of the sort of the ethics of visibility and data and reporting, try to come up with a way of measuring violence in the IDM that brings together the things that we know make a difference between men and women, or where the differences are when we've seen that data, and that's in the frequency of their experience of violence. And so really trying to make sure that in our indicators we are bringing together both frequency and intensity. But in the end, I think the thing to say here is if we're finding that we get to a position where the measurement challenge is so significant, either in safety terms or in terms of the risk of data being used against the broader projects and work that we're doing, I think we would need to think very seriously about what we're doing there.
Yeah, if I can, especially talking about interpreting statistics, for me, there's questions around scrutinising statistics and scrutinising sources. We'll often see statistics as this kind of objective facts, but, making sure that, you're questioning the sources, how they've got their numbers, how they've derived their statistics, what questions they've asked as well, what are their data sources and populations and so on, how has that number been derived, is the first thing I'm looking at, especially when I'm looking at trafficking statistics. The other thing I kind of want to just make a quick comment on, and this I think is also a power and an effect of numbers as well, is we have a lot of definitional ambiguities, especially around trafficking, and notions of exploitation as well. And then one of the things that we've got with numbers is that it also does work. When you are quantifying, it does sometimes work to fix meaning. And I think that's an issue that we do need to discuss as well. And if I'm talking about my experiences, especially in my qualitative work, the oral histories and everything that I've collected, what misses for me when I'm looking at the numbers, it doesn't tell me about things like stigmatisation, marginalisation, criminalisation. It doesn't tell me about cultural patternings and differences and the interpersonal strategies. It doesn't tell me about structural violence, the global economic order, worsening labour conditions, the erosion of workers' rights, your free trade, and that the movement of people and goods and services is much looser, but at the same time we're seeing ever greater restrictions placed upon people's movements. And so for me, sometimes those sorts of things are missing, and they're really hard to capture when we're talking and trying to quantify people's experiences.
Thank you. We're now opening up to audience questions. There's some roving mics roving around.
Hi. My question was sort of prompted by Larissa but could be answered by anyone. Thinking about worsening labour conditions, would you consider things like gender pay inequality and other forms of economic discrimination women disproportionately face? Would you consider that a form of gender-based violence?
Maybe we just have one response per question would be great. Yeah.
I personally think that that's category confusion and would be broadening out the understanding of violence too far. I think naming the pay inequality as a profound example, and the persistence of pay inequality is a profound example of patriarchy, of deep structures that continue to shape our society, I have no problem with. I think naming it as violence, I think that maybe muddies and blurs things rather than helping. I see what I think we've got other tools for naming its significance than calling it violence, would be my thought.
The other panellists can join if they want to, by the way. I'm not trying to be too tough.
Thank you very much for an amazing panel, and I was really struck by the way in which all of you are kind of working to challenge the frames we use, as well as working towards practical, concrete outcomes within those frames. And one of the things that I was thinking about is, in relation to statistics, is the issue of definitions. And Larissa, you kind of touched on it in your last comment, but the issue of kind of taking legal or other official or hegemonic definitions, and then they become your frame for gathering statistics. But then how do you also go about contesting those frames and expanding those definitions at the same time that you're doing that? So I guess it was just a broad question of how you work with legal or other hegemonic definitions. Anastasia gave the example of a legal definition of sexual harassment and how some people might not see themselves in that definition.
From a really practical perspective, I think a lot of the research, and I think Anastasia's is a really good example of saying, I think definitions are something that we can use as researchers, and it's something that we can help frame what we're talking about. In survey data, though, I don't think we can use the terminology, and I don't think we can use the definitions. I think we've shown it pretty much. Project after project, survey after survey has shown what you need to do is the sorts of things that Anastasia was talking about in terms of actually, for example, using behaviours. So you're not defining the situation. And I'm thinking, I'm just even thinking back to my experiences as a counsellor, the number of people I'd see in sexual assault who would come in and say, I haven't really experienced a sexual assault, but I want to talk to you about something. And they'd experienced, the most horrific sexual assaults that they didn't classify or define as sexual assault. So I think the importance of actually moving away from definitions as being a category that we as researchers can use to help make sense of our data are important. But in terms of actually, if you want to gather the data, you have to look at more sophisticated ways of describing the problem or helping people to identify and disclose.
Yeah, look, to really follow up on especially the use of hegemonic understandings, and often what happens with that is it sometimes comes with an erasure, especially of Southern voices and Southern experiences. Drawing from my own oral history work, I did work with women who were debt bonded in, Cambodian brothels. Under the trafficking laws and the UN protocol, they would have been defined as victims of trafficking. But the women themselves did not see themselves as victims of trafficking and didn't understand, and nor did they talk about or interpret their experiences in that way. So, when we are talking about, with the UN protocol, if you are using those hegemonic understandings, then it does come sometimes with the erasure of local people's experiences and how they might understand and interpret that for themselves. So it's also sometimes reflective of some power imbalances, going over there and using northern frameworks and perspectives and sort of forcing that onto countries, who don't have that similar sort of power and ability to be able to be part of that group that's sort of doing that defining as well, and especially for local sex workers in Cambodia, and the difficulties they face trying to challenge what would be a normative understanding of trafficking and their ability to be able to do that, And the other thing I wanted to kind of comment, and when you are using legal definitions or trying to operationalise those, it is quite problematic and very difficult. And again, I'm thinking of the definition of trafficking that's within the UN protocol, and I don't know if anyone knows it, but it is an extraordinarily difficult definition. It's very legalistic. It's very difficult to try and explain. It normally takes me quite some time, and it needs to be broken down into a lot of key stages. So operationalising that and using that within surveys can be quite problematic as well.
Hi. I just was a bit curious about your own experiences as researchers, as the kind of destigmatisation of gender-based violence has started to occur, in that people are more willing to respond to surveys or to speak up about their experiences. I was just wondering, you spoke a bit before about non-response rates. I was just wondering if they have changed over time as the kind of global conversation around gender inequality and gender-based violence has increased, whether you've seen a change in response rates and whether that's been difficult in kind of interpreting data, if that makes sense.
I'm not sure about response rates. I mean, I think, there's been lots of studies that have been done in social research over many years that often find a fairly low sort of 17% to 20% sort of response rate for social research, and it's not better for sexual violence. In fact, often it's quite difficult still to get responses. But one thing that your question did make me kind of reflect on, and I think some of my colleagues have had this similar experience, is that as academics, as public sort of advocates and activists on these issues, when we are engaging on these topics in public discussions, in media, in public presentations, what I've been observing, I think, over the last maybe even just 2 years, is that every time I speak publicly, I will get emails and responses from people that have experienced violence telling me their story and talking about the difference it makes that there is this public conversation now that validates their experience and that, gives some sort of weight that yes, this really did happen to them and it's terrible and we should all be acting together to try and stop it. And that's something that I think I've seen a real shift in just the last 2 years of doing research, despite the fact that I've been doing research and speaking publicly on these issues for about 10 years. And I don't know if others have sort of had similar experiences, but I do wonder if that is perhaps a positive sign about the strength that we're beginning to see for survivors in talking about their experiences, because there is more of a public conversation and hopefully sometimes a more respectful public conversation than perhaps what we've been used to.
So some of the panellists have obviously talked about the impacts of using quantitative data. I was wondering if the panel could also talk about different understandings in statistical terminology, like proportion and person years and other things, and what the impacts might be of that.
I'm going to do what a good person does in an interview situation and say I'll take that question in a direction that works for me. I think the question of having your user in mind when you are writing about the data that you're using is really critical, and one of the priorities for us, and I think you're seeing as an increasing focus in the area of data, is data visualisation. So that people who are not quite sure about the difference between person years or proportion or percentage or raw numbers, that you can be trying to build into your presentation of the data a number of different ways of trying to interrogate that data, to try to make it more intuitive for people who are not deep statistical specialists, because certainly I think for policymakers that's most policymakers, and so starting to use visuals and colour and others, that things that change in scale that will help no matter what particular denominator or enumerator you're using, to try and make those data come alive for people in ways that helps them readily grasp the nature of the problem. So that may not be what you're asking, but I think the question that you're pointing to, which is how do we do this in ways that are clear and in ways that don't obscure the data, I think in some ways the ways we present that data to help give people a sense of context and scale is a really critical part of that story.
And I just wanted to add just quickly too that I think one of the dangers, and perhaps we haven't covered it in enough depth, is the danger of the oversimplification of numbers. So I know, for instance, in some of our research on image-based abuse, which has had enormous uptake publicly, the media was only reporting 1 in 5 Australians victims of image-based abuse, which is in fact statistically not correct because it wasn't a representative survey, and we can't say that 1 in 5 of Australians have actually experienced image-based abuse. And also that figure doesn't give you any sense of, the various ANOVAs and logistical regressions and the different p-values that, are necessary in actually unpacking what's a significant finding in that survey or not. And unfortunately, I think there's a tendency of both media and policy and just a sort of a surface level, perhaps public capacity to engage with those numbers, to not look beyond, that simple 1 in 5 figure or 1 in 3 figure, and not really have the statistical vocabulary to kind of look critically at what is that figure actually reporting, and what claims can we, realistically and confidently make on the basis of that figure.
Thank you. I might be the last person, I think, yeah. Thank you all for your time, and I really appreciate you sharing your minds with us. Just one question based on your research, looking at the potential future and forecasting increases or plateaus, and how do we consider in the next 4 years whether this is an increasing problem or whether changes in service could help to improve that, and how do we measure that?
A bit of a plug. I just want to acknowledge a couple of people in the audience, actually, from some colleagues from Our Watch. So Our Watch led a project called Change the Story with us, with Anne Rose and Vic Health, and one of the things that we will be releasing soon will be the Guide to Prevention Monitoring that will look at exactly this question. How do we monitor? How do we work out whether what we're doing is making a difference, etc.? I think, though, for me, I often say this as well publicly, one of the key really important things that I think this Guide to Prevention Monitoring talks about is the importance of monitoring over points in time, and what might be success at one point in time is not success at another point in time. And the example, I think that's the best example, is where we look at blocks in short, medium and long term. And in the short term, we would measure success as things like an increase in reporting. And that is a positive thing. That's what we'd want to see. That would give us indications that people are feeling more confident, comfortable to report, etc. In the longer term, though, if we're talking 15, 20, 30, 40 years in the future, if we've still got reporting rates up as high as they are, what we'd actually be wanting to see is a drop in the numbers, and not a drop in the numbers of reporting, but a drop in the numbers of actual incidents, or prevalence, I should say. To be specific and use the terms properly. So we'd actually want to see a drop in the number of people who've experienced violence. So I think that's a really contingent question on what we know works, and how we measure what is working will change over time, and we have to be sophisticated in how we look at that, and that's a very difficult story to tell the public and a non-specialist audience easily, because often politicians will go, oh no, that intervention was a complete failure because the number of people experiencing violence has increased, when actually those of us who are specialists would say actually it was a raging success because we're now getting real numbers rather than only the people who were reporting before. So I think that's kind of a complex thing to answer.
Any really quick final comments on the camera? Well, we've had such an interesting discussion, and I want to thank you all for coming today and for the wonderful questions. They were all excellent questions. But most of all, I'd like to thank the panel, Anastasia, Larissa, Mayart and Jo, for coming along today and sharing with us their wisdom on this issue, and for really, I think, getting at the complexity of numbers in relation to gendered violence. If we can put our hands together and thank them. And just finally, I'd like to thank Beck, who's done a wonderful job of organising the event today, alongside Michelle as well, who can't be here today, and also Georgina as well. Thank you very much. And hopefully we'll see you here next time. Thanks.
Thanks, Nicola. Can I just say that if anyone is interested in knowing more about the individual deprivation measure research that's going on at the moment, there's some material out on the desk as you leave. Thanks.